In the frozen heart of Yakutia, a young orphan embarked on a desperate hunt to save her blind grandmother from starvation. But when 1,200 hungry wolves surrounded her, her doom seemed certain. The temperature plummeted to 96 degrees, and hope dwindled until an unlikely guardian emerged from the snows. A colossal silhouette emerged from the blizzard, not a wolf, but something far older and more monumental. The snow covering its thick, shaggy brown fur seemed to meld with the frozen earth itself, and its eyes, glowing like embers beneath heavy brows, fixed on the pack. It was a bear, but no ordinary bear. Its size defied logic, a mountain of muscle and fury, with scars that spoke of endless winters and primordial battles. The icy air trembled with a growl that made the ground vibrate beneath Yakuta's numb feet. It was not a warning sound, but a declaration of dominance, raw and brutal. The pack, once a relentless tide of teeth and fury, hesitated. 1,200 pairs of yellow eyes now divided their attention between the small human and the colossus that had just invaded their imminent feast. A heavy silence descended upon the tundra, broken only by the biting wind and the sound of Yakuta's own heart hammering like a war drum in her chest. The young orphan could barely breathe. Her muscles were tense, ready for flight, but to where? The bear was a force of nature, unpredictable and lethal. Had it come to save her, or was it just another predator drawn by the scent of weak flesh, ready to dispute the spoils? The terror that had paralyzed her before the wolves now multiplied, a mixture of dread and a tiny, desperate spark of hope. The bear took a step forward, slow, deliberate, each paw kicking up plumes of snow. The growl deepened, and some wolves in the front ranks instinctively recoiled, their tails dragging low. But hunger was a powerful instinct, and the mass of predators was too vast to be easily dispersed. The howls resumed, more cautious now, but still numerous, forming a menacing chorus that seemed to envelop the bear and the girl in an icy embrace. Suddenly, with surprising speed for its size, the bear charged, not at Yakuta, but at the nearest portion of the pack. There was no prolonged struggle, just the sound of bodies colliding, howls of pain, and the panic of dozens of wolves being tossed like ragdolls. The charge opened a momentary clearing in the living wall of predators, a sliver of opportunity that Yakuta, in her state of shock, almost missed. Her eyes swept the opening, then returned to the bear, which now stood towering, watching the wolves as they reorganized, confused and furious. For an instant, the bear's gaze seemed to meet hers, a brief and inexplicable connection that sent a shiver down her spine, not just of fear, but of something deeper, almost of recognition. The clearing wouldn't last. The wolves, though momentarily shaken, were too many, and hunger made them bold. They began to close the circle again, circling the bear, some attempting to flank, others preparing for a coordinated attack. The gigantic beast was an obstacle, yes, but not an insurmountable barrier for 1,200 empty stomachs. Yakuta knew she had to move. The chance was minimal, but it was the only one she had. She clutched her bow in her numb hands, feeling the cold metal against her skin. The tundra stretched infinitely around them, a white, deadly desert. Where to go? The bear turned slightly, its eyes fixed on the approaching wolves, but then, without warning, it let out a low, guttural roar and took a step, not towards the pack, but backwards, towards Yakuta. The girl's heart pounded. Was the momentary protection over? Would she now be the next target, the prize contested between the bear and the wolves? The colossus stopped a few feet from her, so close that Yakuta could feel the warmth of its massive body, a fleeting oasis in the biting cold. It lowered its head slowly, its deep, ancient eyes fixed on her with an intensity that seemed to pierce her soul. A strong scent of wet earth and wild forest emanated from it. What did it want? What did that gaze, that unexpected proximity mean? The line between salvation and perdition had never seemed so thin, so indistinct under the icy Yakutian sky. The thin, icy air seemed to freeze in Yakuta's lungs. The warmth emanating from the bear's body was a fleeting illusion, for terror froze her blood. Those eyes, which had previously promised savage fury against the pack, now examined her with an ancient, almost painful curiosity. She couldn't look away, trapped in the depth of that brown abyss. The strong scent of wet earth and wild forest filled her nostrils, mixing with the metallic tang of fear that rose in her throat. A low growl, almost a murmur, vibrated in the bear's chest, and Yakuta felt the tremor through the frozen ground. It was not a sound of threat, but something that seemed to come from ages past. A lament or a warning. Slowly, the bear's enormous head tilted even further, and its furry snout lightly touched Yakuta's shoulder. The reindeer hide coat seemed to burn under the touch, and an electric shock coursed through her body. She didn't move, unable to react, her muscles petrified. The touch lasted only an instant, but it was enough for the girl to feel the roughness of the fur and the creature's contained power. The bear then drew back its snout, but kept its eyes fixed on her. Then, unmistakably, it turned its head and looked towards a narrow fissure between two rock formations, a few dozen yards away. The fissure was almost hidden by accumulated snow, a passage she would never have noticed on her own. Was it an invitation, a command, or a trap? The wolves' howls regained strength, closer now, more urgent. The grey, hungry mass was reorganizing, circling the bear and Yakuta, closing the encirclement again. Time was running out. The clearing created by the bear's first attack had almost vanished. Yakuta knew she had to decide, and fast. The bear took another step backward, this time towards the fissure, and let out a stronger roar, a sound that echoed through the rocks and made the nearest wolves recoil a step, though the hesitation was brief. You want me to go there?" Yakuta whispered, her voice hoarse from cold and fear. The bear didn't respond with words, of course, but its eyes seemed to confirm, and it moved again, positioning its colossal body between Yakuta and the advancing pack. It was madness, a desperate gamble. But what else did she have? Certain death in the wolves' jaws, or an uncertain chance with this unlikely guardian? The image of her grandmother, frail and starving in the cabin, flashed in her mind. She had to try. With a renewed breath of determination, Yakuta clutched her bow tighter and began to run. Her feet barely felt the ground, numbed by the intense cold and panic. She bolted towards the fissure, each step sinking into the deep snow, her muscles screaming in protest. Behind her, the sound of battle intensified. The bear had charged again, but this time the attack was more brutal, more desperate. Screams of pain and howls of rage tore through the air, mixed with the bear's deep roar. Yakuta didn't look back. She couldn't. Her eyes were fixed on the fissure, the only point of hope in the white vastness. She could feel the heat of the wolf's breath on her neck, the icy air searing her lungs. A wolf, faster and bolder than the others, managed to get past the bear and lunged at her. Its sharp teeth glinted under the pale winter light. In a moment of pure adrenaline, Yakuta spun, drew an arrow from her quiver, and nocked it with a speed she didn't even know she possessed. The wolf was a few feet away, leaping. She released the string. A whistle cut the air, and the arrow found its mark. The wolf fell with a strangled yelp, rolling in the snow. Yakuta didn't stop. There was no time for emotion, only for survival. She reached the fissure, squeezing between the icy rocks. It was narrow, barely allowing her slender body to pass. The smell of stone and ice filled the air. Inside, the darkness was almost complete, only a sliver of pale light coming from the entrance. She could hear the chaos outside, the sounds of the struggle between the bear and the pack. A chorus of fury and despair. The bear was fighting for her. The realization hit her with the force of a punch. It was not just a predator, but a protector. Yakuta moved forward through the passage, groping the damp, icy walls. The fissure deepened, and the tundra's light rapidly faded. She could feel a cold breeze coming from somewhere further ahead, indicating an exit. But what awaited her on the other side? And the bear, could it hold back 1,200 hungry wolves? The line between life and death, which had once seemed thin, now twisted into a dark and unpredictable labyrinth, and YAKUT found herself alone again, but with a new and heavy debt of gratitude. YAKUT felt the damp cold of the rocks against her fingertips as she squeezed through the fissure. The echo of the howls and growls of the battle outside began to fade, swallowed by the passage's depth. Every inch she advanced was a step away from imminent death, but also a step away from the bear, whose fate she could not even imagine. The thought tightened her chest, a strange mix of guilt and profound recognition. That giant, a force of nature, had placed itself between her and the pack, an act of sacrifice that defied all logic of the food chain. The darkness deepened, dense and oppressive, and the breeze she had felt before turned into an icy wind that whistled, coming from somewhere further ahead. YAKUT groped her way, her eyes straining to distinguish any outline in the blackness. The smell of stone and ice gave way to a pungent aroma of frozen earth and a freshness that seemed to promise a more open space. Her feet slipped on the ice that formed on the passage's uneven floor. Suddenly, the fissure widened. It was not an abrupt exit, but a gradual expansion into an ice cave. The pale tundra light, filtered through a distant opening, revealed an internal landscape of ice stalactites and stalagmites, glowing with a ghostly blue. The wind howled through the formations, producing an ethereal sound that seemed to sing the solitude of the place. The cold here was even more intense, a cold that burned her lungs with every breath. YAKUT stopped, her body trembling. Not from exhaustion, but from a new form of apprehension. The cave was vast, its limits lost in the gloom. In the center, a colossal ice formation rose like an ancient altar, and around it, the floor was a sea of untouched snow, sprinkled with small, dark stones. The silence, which now dominated, was almost more terrifying than the battle's noise. It was a silence of abandonment. She took a hesitant step, her eyes sweeping the icy expanse. There were no signs of life, no tracks, just the untouched purity of the ice. The exit she hoped to find to the open tundra didn't exist here. The cave seemed to deepen into smaller tunnels, branching off in unknown directions. It was a labyrinth within a labyrinth, and with each glimmer of hope, a new layer of despair was revealed. The weight of responsibility for her grandmother, which had driven her to hunt and face the wolves, now mixed with concern for the bear. She had fled, leaving him behind. The image of its deep, ancient eyes, the touch of its snout on her shoulder, persisted. It had trusted her, or at least guided her. And she had abandoned it. A pang of shame hit her, but it was quickly replaced by the urgency of survival. She couldn't go back. She had to move forward. A distant sound, a dry crack, echoed in the vastness of the cave. YAKUT flinched, her bow raised, an arrow ready. Was it the sound of ice shifting, breaking under the weight of winter, or something more? The air grew dense, charged with a cold, static energy. She could feel her hair bristling on her neck, her eyes fixed on the central ice formation. Something was different. It wasn't just ice. There was a shape, an almost human silhouette trapped within the translucent mass. A tremor ran through her body. It was not a snowman nor an illusion. It was the figure of a woman, seemingly frozen in suspended animation, her facial features distorted by the ice and bluish light, but unmistakably there. Her arms were outstretched, as if reaching for something, or being pulled into the depths. YAKUT's heart pounded, a furious drum in her chest. It made no sense. Who was this woman? And how had she ended up here, imprisoned in the heart of an ice cave, in the middle of Yakutia? The tundra, with all its known dangers, now seemed a safe refuge compared to the icy mystery that opened before her. The promise of an exit had transformed into an enigma, an invitation to an even deeper and stranger journey, where the rules of nature seemed to bend to something older and inexplicable. Yakuta's heart hammered erratically, a furious drum against her ribs, as her eyes fixed on the figure imprisoned in the ice. It was not a mirage, nor a trick of the bluish light filtering through distant crevices. It was the unmistakable form of a woman, suspended in an icy eternity in the heart of Yakutia. Yakuta's skin bristled, a chill that didn't come from the cave's extreme cold, but from the sheer improbability of the scene. The woman stood upright, her arms outstretched upwards, palms open, as if trying to touch something invisible above her, or perhaps as if she were being lifted by an unseen force. Her long, dark hair was spread around her head, forming a frozen halo. Her face, though distorted by the imperfections of the ice, seemed to carry an expression of serene resignation, mixed with a deep, ancient sorrow. She wore what appeared to be garments made of fur and leather, adorned with intricate patterns that Yakuta had never seen before, woven in colors faded by time and ice. An icy whisper seemed to sweep through the vast cave, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Was it the wind, howling through the ice formations, or something more? Yakuta felt a pressure in her chest, a feeling of being watched, not by physical eyes, but by a presence that permeated the very air. The silence that followed the howls was even heavier, laden with a story she couldn't decipher. She took a hesitant step, the ice cracking beneath her boots. With each step, the figure seemed to grow in significance, becoming more real, more impossible. The urgency to find an exit, to return to her grandmother, battled against the irresistible pull of this mystery. Who was this woman? A lost traveler, a legend frozen in time. What had nature, in its fury and majesty, done here? Memories of stories told by her grandmother about tundra spirits and ancient beings that inhabited the depths of the earth echoed in her mind. But this was no story. It was real, palpable, and hauntingly beautiful in its stillness. Yakuta extended a trembling hand as if to touch the ice, but stopped before her fingers reached the cold surface. The air around the figure seemed to vibrate with a subtle, almost imperceptible energy, like the hum of a bowstring about to be released. Suddenly, a faint, pulsating light began to emanate from the center of the ice formation, from the woman's chest. It was not an intense glow, but a soft blue-green pulse, which expanded and contracted, illuminating the woman's frozen features with a new, ethereal life. The ice around her seemed to absorb and reflect this light, transforming the cave into a sanctuary of ghostly colors. Yakuta stepped back, gasping. The sound of her own pounding heart reverberated in the cave's silence. The pulse of light intensified, and a subtle tremor ran through the ice floor. Small fragments of ice fell from the stalactites on the ceiling, hitting the ground with dry cracks that spread through the space. The cave was alive, or at least reacting to the presence of the frozen woman. It was not just a figure, it was a source of something, a dormant power that seemed to awaken. The air grew denser, colder, and Yakuta felt her lungs burn with each breath. She could feel the pressure of that power, an elemental force that transcended human understanding. Her instincts screamed at her to flee, to move away from that sacred and dangerous place. But her feet seemed rooted to the ice. Curiosity, mixed with a reverent terror, held her captive. This was not a place of death, but of suspended life, a secret guarded by Yakutia itself. The woman's figure, now bathed in the pulsating light, seemed to call to her, not with a voice, but with a silent, ancient promise. The tremor intensified, and Yakuta had to lean on an ice stalagmite to maintain her balance. The sound of ice shifting, breaking somewhere in the depths of the cave, grew more audible. It was not the random crackle of cold, but a continuous groan, As if something immense was moving, the cave was transforming, or perhaps revealing itself. The line between life and death, between the natural and the inexplicable, had completely vanished. Yakuta was now on the threshold of something that defied everything she knew, a force that promised to rewrite not only her destiny, but perhaps the very face of the tundra. The tremor intensified, shaking the very ground beneath Yakuta's feet. She leaned on the cold, uneven surface of an ice stalagmite, her knuckles white from the strength of her grip. The continuous groan resonated from the depths of the cave, a monstrous moan that echoed through the vast space, suggesting the slow, inexorable movement of immense ice formations. It was not just the ambient noise of a glacier. It was as if the cave itself was awakening, its ice bones cracking and groaning under an invisible pressure. The blue-green light emanating from the frozen woman's chest pulsed with increasing fervor, casting dancing shadows across the crystalline walls. Each pulsation sent a shock through the air, a wave of icy energy that raised the fine hairs on Yakuta's arms and made her teeth ache. Her breath escaped in thick white clouds, and the cold burned her lungs with an intensity she hadn't felt even on the open tundra. It was a cold that went beyond the physical, an ancient chill that seemed to penetrate her very soul. The ice encasing the woman began to react. Fine cracks, like spiderwebs, began to spread from the source of the light, branching through the translucent prison. They didn't shatter the ice, but delineated new patterns, intricate and luminous, as if an internal plant was being revealed. Through these newly formed fissures, the blue-green light escaped in thin, ethereal rays, drawing fleeting designs on the cave floor. Yakuta's gaze was fixed on the woman's face. The ice's distortion seemed to lessen with each pulse of light, revealing features with agonizing slowness. Her eyes, once obscured, now appeared as deep pools of shadow, carrying a sorrow so profound it seemed to transcend millennia. And then, as the light shone more intensely, Yakuta saw a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on the woman's lips, a gesture of welcome and farewell. A sudden sharp crack echoed, louder than any before. A large slab of ice detached from the ceiling, falling to the cave floor with a thunderous roar that sent vibrations through Yakuta's entire body. She flinched, but her eyes never left the figure. The impact created a gust of wind, carrying with it a faint metallic scent she couldn't identify. The groan intensified, now accompanied by a low, humming vibration that resonated in Yakuta's bones. The entire central formation, the colossal ice altar, began to rotate, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, then gaining momentum. It was as if the woman, or the power within her, was the axis around which the ice world was turning. As the formation rotated, new facets of the ice altar were revealed. On its surface, previously hidden from view, Yakuta saw a series of ancient sculptures. They depicted figures with elongated limbs and animalistic features, dancing under colossal sun and moon. In the center of these sculptures, a symbol repeated, a spiral, intricate and mesmerizing, coiling inwards and outwards simultaneously. It was the same symbol, she realized with a gasp, that was woven into the patterns of the frozen woman's garments. A whisper, clear as a bell but without a source, seemed to form in the very air around Yakuta. It was not a language she understood, but the sound resonated deep within her, a melody of ancient sorrow and profound hope. It was a call she knew, not just for her, but for something dormant within the cave and perhaps within herself. The light from the woman's chest shone one last time, dazzling, enveloping the entire cave in a blue-green glow. Yakuta instinctively shielded her eyes, but the light seemed to penetrate her eyelids, filling her mind with images. Fleeting glimpses of a vast tundra under a sky ablaze with the aurora. a village nestled among snow-covered trees, and a child with eyes like hers, gazing at the stars. When the light receded, leaving the cave in a soft, ethereal luminescence, the ice around the woman had changed. The cracks had deepened, and a section of ice directly in front of her chest had fractured into a mosaic of shimmering shards. And there, revealed within the opening, was not just the woman's form, but an object clutched in her frozen hands, a small, intricately carved amulet, glowing with a faint residual blue light. It had the shape of the spiral symbol, pulsing with a life that defied its imprisonment. The groaning subsided, replaced by a deep silence, heavy with expectation. The cave had revealed its secret, and YAKUT, still trembling, felt an undeniable pull towards the amulet. It was not just an object, it was a key, an invitation, a piece of the ancient promise. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her journey through the frozen wilderness had not been a flight, but a pilgrimage, leading her to this exact moment, to this frozen heart of the world, where her destiny, and perhaps Yakutia's destiny, awaited. The deep silence that filled the cave now seemed to carry the weight of millennia, an expectation that made the air vibrate. YAKUT, her heart still hammering against her ribs, felt her feet move almost of their own accord. Each step towards the ice altar, the sleeping woman, and the pulsating amulet was a crossing of an invisible threshold. The residual blue-green glow of the spiral object cast a ghostly light on the woman's face, accentuating the serenity of her expression, a smile that now seemed more an invitation than a farewell. The shimmering ice beneath her boots crunched softly, the only sounds in the icy immensity. The cold, once a sharp pain, now seemed to envelop YAKUT, not with hostility, but with an ancient familiarity, as if the cave recognized her. She extended a hand, her gloved fingers trembling slightly. The amulet, visible through the fissure in the ice, called to her with a silent urgency. It was a small object, but its presence dominated the vast space, an epicenter of a power she could barely begin to comprehend. When her fingers brushed the surface of the ice that still imprisoned the amulet, a wave of intense cold, unlike any she had ever felt, coursed through her arm. It was not the paralyzing cold of the tundra, but a cold that seemed to resonate with ancient memories, with the very essence of frozen time. The ice around the amulet, which had previously seemed solid, now seemed to yield under her touch, becoming malleable, almost liquid for an instant. Small cracks spread rapidly, and with an almost inaudible sigh of air, the section of ice broke free, revealing the amulet completely. YAKUT took it. The piece of ice that encased it crumbled into crystalline dust, slipping through her fingers. The amulet was heavier than it looked, made of a dark, smooth stone, cold to the touch, but with a subtle, pulsating warmth that seemed to come from within. The intricate spiral, perfectly carved, seemed to spin in her hands, and the blue-green glow intensified for a moment, illuminating the lines of her palm. The instant the amulet rested in her hand, the cave seemed to hold its breath. The residual light that bathed the frozen woman faded, and the cracks in the ice that imprisoned her began to heal, slowly sealing themselves, as if the mission of that revelation had been fulfilled. The woman's expression, once a mix of welcome and farewell, now seemed to resolve into a profound peace, her eyes closing in eternal sleep. She was not disappearing, but returning to her state of rest, her secret once again guarded. YAKUT felt a strange connection, a current of knowledge that seemed to flow from the amulet into her. They were not words, but feelings, fleeting images of vast landscapes, of starry skies and an ancient people who lived in harmony with nature, respecting its spirits and its mysteries. She saw the tundra, not just as a place of danger and deprivation, but as an ancient mother, full of power and wisdom. The hunger in her stomach and the cold in her bones, though still present, seemed to lessen before this new understanding. The amulet in her hand was more than a magical object. It was a link to the past, a promise for the future. It was a reminder that she was not alone, that Yakutia, in its brutality and beauty, held secrets that could change everything. But with this revelation also came a sense of immense responsibility. What did it mean to possess this amulet? What power did it hold? And how could she use it to save her grandmother, to survive the pack that awaited her outside? A low, distant sound, a prolonged howl, broke the cave's silence. It was not the solitary howl of a wolf, but the chorus of many, echoing through the ice passages, coming from somewhere above and beyond the cave, reminding her of the brutal reality that awaited her. The cave had revealed its secret, but the world outside still demanded her attention. Yakuta clutched the amulet in her hand, feeling the pulsating warmth against her palm. It was time to leave the ice sanctuary and face the tundra again, but now she was no longer alone. She carried a piece of Yakutia in her hands, an echo of a forgotten age, and a new hope ignited in her heart. She had to find a way out. Her grandmother needed her. The chorus of howls, low and distant at first, grew in intensity, filling the icy void of the cave with a melody of hunt and threat. Each sound was an icy blow to Yakuta's chest, ripping her from her contemplation and plunging her back into brutal reality. She pressed the amulet against her palm, feeling the dark stone pulse with a subtle warmth, a counterpoint to the coldness that surrounded her and the fear that rooted in her heart. The newfound hope was fragile, but the amulet was a comforting weight, a silent promise that something had changed. Her eyes scanned the cave, seeking an exit, no longer a desperate escape but a path forward. The amulet's blue-green light intensified for an instant, and Yakuta noticed that the ancient sculptures on the ice altar, once mere static images, now seemed to vibrate. The spiral, the symbol that repeated in each figure and on the amulet's surface, drew her attention to a specific point on the wall opposite the entrance. The ice there seemed thinner, with an almost translucent luminescence, as if the cave itself was revealing a new path. Guided by an intuition that came from the amulet, Yakuta walked towards that wall. The intense cold emanating seemed to invite her, no longer to repel her. As she touched the ice, the dark stone in her hand vibrated, and a low sound, almost a murmur, resonated from within the amulet. The ice in front of Yakuta began to yield, small cracks spreading like veins of light, until a circular section broke free with a soft snap, revealing a narrow, dark passage that sloped upwards. The passage was dark and winding, the air dense and cold, but the amulet in Yakuta's hand emitted a soft blue-green light that illuminated the path ahead, dispelling the deepest shadows. Each step echoed, and the smell of frozen earth and ancient ice mixed with the metallic odor she had sensed before, now more pronounced. The wolves' howls seemed closer, louder, reverberating through the ice and rock walls, indicating that they were approaching the main entrance of the cave, or perhaps had already surrounded it. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, the passage opened to the open air. Yakuta emerged from a hidden fissure in a rock formation, a high point on the tundra, not far from where her dying campfire still released a faint smoke. The icy wind whipped her face, and snow began to fall again, large, heavy flakes dancing in the air. But what paralyzed her was not the cold or the snow, it was the sight before her. The tundra, once a vast white desert, now seethed. Thousands of eyes gleamed in the twilight darkness, amber and golden points stretching as far as the eye could see. The shadows of the wolves moved in waves, a living tide of fur and teeth that completely surrounded her position. It was not just the 1,200 she had estimated. It seemed the very earth had transformed into wolves. A deep, collective growl rose from the ground, a primal sound that made the earth tremble beneath her feet and the air vibrate with menace. Yakuta recoiled instinctively, clutching the amulet. The blue-green light in her hand flickered more intensely, and she felt a wave of icy energy course through her body, not paralyzing cold, but a strange vitality, as if the blood of the tundra flowed in her veins. The fear was overwhelming, but something within her refused to yield. The amulet's teachings, the visions of the earth as an ancient mother, echoed in her mind. She was not alone. A wolf, larger than the others, with eyes that seemed like flames, stepped forward, stopping a few feet from the base of the rock formation. Its posture was one of dominance, its presence an oppressive weight. It raised its head and let out a howl that was not of the hunt, but of an ancestral challenge, a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of the night sky. The pack's chorus responded, a million voices united in a single declaration of power. Yakuta raised the amulet, the spiral's light dancing on her face. She didn't know what to do, but she knew she couldn't surrender. Her grandmother awaited her. Yakutia, in its brutal beauty, had given her a secret and now demanded it back. What would come next she didn't know, but the destiny of her people and her own was about to be rewritten beneath the aurora borealis that began to shimmer, faint and distant on the horizon. The alpha wolf's howl tore through the air, a declaration of war that echoed through the icy valley. Thousands of voices, a chilling chorus, responded to its call, and the entire pack advanced a step, their paws thudding on the packed snow with a dull, menacing sound. The alpha's eyes, glowing like embers, fixed on Yakuta, and the massive creature hunched, muscles tensed beneath its thick fur, ready to spring. The deep growl that emerged from its throat made the ground beneath Yakuta's feet vibrate. The amulet's blue-green light in her hand pulsed with a feverish intensity, a rhythm that seemed to mirror the accelerated beats of her own heart. She felt the icy energy, once a subtle current, now grow, expanding beyond her palm, enveloping her in an invisible aura. The visions of the earth, as an ancient mother, of a people who whispered with the spirits of Yakutia, flooded her mind. She was not just holding a stone, she was holding the very voice of the tundra. With a cry that was more a challenge than a lament, Yakuta raised the amulet even higher, pointing it at the sky that began to tinge green and pink with the first dances of the aurora borealis. The instant she did, a subtle tremor ran through the ground. It was not the wolf's growl, but something deeper, more primordial. The amulet's light exploded in a dazzling brilliance, and Yakuta felt an unbreakable connection with the earth, with the ice, with the wind that whipped her hair. The tremor grew, transforming into a dull roar that resonated from the depths. The rocks beneath Yakuta's feet shook violently, and she staggered, clinging to the rock formation to keep from falling. The pack, once so cohesive and menacing, was caught by surprise. The alpha's howl turned into a confused bark, and the wolves around it began to retreat, their movements uncoordinated by the unstable ground. A deafening roar erupted from the earth. Wide, deep cracks tore through the tundra's icy surface, spreading like gigantic spiderwebs. The ground opened into abyssal fissures, revealing endless darkness below. The metallic scent Yakuta had sensed in the cave now intensified, mixing with a sulphurous odor that burned her nostrils. Screams of panic erupted from the pack, no longer hunting howls, but laments of terror. The earth was tearing itself apart. The alpha wolf, which was about to spring, lost its balance. Its paws slipped on the unstable rocks, and it slid dangerously close to one of the opening fissures. Its eyes, once full of fury, now gleamed with a primal fear. The aurora borealis in the sky, previously faint, exploded in vibrant colors, dancing in spirals of light that seemed to mimic the chaotic movement of the earth. Rays of green and blue-green light descended from the sky, touching the ground at specific points, and where they touched, the ice cracked and broke even further. Yakuta watched, petrified, as the tundra transformed. Hundreds of wolves, caught in the panic and confusion, fell into the newly formed fissures, their bodies disappearing into the abyssal darkness with cut-off, desperate howls. The landscape was being rewritten in real time, mountains of ice and rock crumbling, valleys forming where plains once lay. Yakuta's dying campfire, her only mark in the vastness, was swallowed by a fissure disappearing without a trace. The earthquake, as violent as it had begun, gradually subsided, leaving behind an unrecognizable tundra. The icy wind brought with it the smell of freshly opened earth and the distant echo of solitary howls, full of pain and loss. The pack was dispersed, fragmented, the survivors running in random directions, away from the epicenter of the Earth's fury. The alpha wolf, still visible, was cornered on a small island of ice, separated from the fissures by impassable abysses, its posture of dominance broken, replaced by desperate caution. Yakuta stood, unharmed, the amulet still glowing softly in her hand. The pulsating warmth was now a part of her, an extension of her own being. Yakutia had spoken, and its voice had been a roar of ice and earth. Nature had intervened, and the price had been brutal. But she had survived. Her grandmother, hope ignited anew, stronger than ever, born from the ashes of destruction. She had to find a way through the new landscape, a path that would lead her back home. Yakuta felt the echo of that primordial power still vibrate in her bones, a chilling reminder of life's fragility in the face of nature's majesty. She stood, unharmed, but the world around her was a testament to the unleashed destruction. The icy air brought the metallic scent of freshly opened earth, mixed with the smell of snow and pine that always punctuated the tundra. Her eyes swept the unrecognizable landscape. What was once a vast, uniform plain was now a labyrinth of deep fissures and unstable ice and rock peaks. The wind whistled through the new gorges, a cold lament that seemed to carry the lost howls of the pack. The campfire, her small mark of presence, had vanished, swallowed by the earth, as if it had never existed. The amulet in her hand pulsed with a soft glow, almost a silent heartbeat. The energy that had enveloped her during the cataclysm had diminished, but a persistent warmth radiated from the stone, an unbreakable link to the force that had rewritten the tundra. She had not consciously invoked that power, but she felt the responsibility weigh upon her. Yakutia was not just a home, it was a living entity, and she had witnessed its fury. Below, the alpha wolf, once the personification of threat, was now a solitary and cornered figure. Its eyes, which had once burned with defiance, seemed lost in a mix of fear and confusion as it inspected the impassable fissures that separated it from the rest of the world. The pack was dispersed, the survivors running in panic, their silhouettes rapidly diminishing on the horizon. The immediate threat had been removed, but the journey home had become infinitely more perilous. Yakuta needed to descend from that rock formation. The amulet in her hand glowed more intensely, and she noticed that the blue-green light not only illuminated, but also seemed to trace a subtle path on the unstable surface of the ice and rock. Small points of light flickered like cosmic breadcrumbs, indicating a safer slope, a series of ledges that could be climbed. It was a precarious path, but it was a path. Her heart still pounding, but driven by a new determination, Yakuta began to descend. Each movement was calculated, each foothold tested. The ice cracked beneath her boots, and the wind tried to tear her from the rock, but she clung on, the image of her blind, starving grandmother etched in her mind. With each meter she descended, the landscape opened up even more, revealing the scale of the devastation. Enormous blocks of ice, the size of small cabins, lay overturned, and craters lightly fumed, exhaling the sulphurous smell she had sensed in the cave. She finally reached the unstable ground of the new tundra. her feet sinking into the loose snow that covered the smaller cracks. The air was heavier here, the post-cataclysmic silence more oppressive. But the amulet did not fail, its constant light pointing north in the direction of her home. Suddenly, a faint sound caught her attention. It was not a howl, but a low whimper coming from behind a newly formed ice pillar. YAKUT hesitated, the amulet vibrating in her hand. Curiosity and caution wrestled in her chest. Slowly, she approached, peering around the icy obstacle. There lay a young wolf, a cub, trapped beneath a displaced block of ice. Its brown eyes gleamed with pain and fear, and it whimpered faintly, unable to free itself. It was one of the many that nature had injured or separated. YAKUT felt a pang in her heart. The same force that had saved her had injured this innocent creature. The amulet in her hand seemed to react, its light pulsing with a different energy, no longer of raw power, but of silent compassion. She couldn't simply move on. YAKUT, she knew, was harsh, but also a mother. And in that moment, YAKUT felt that her own journey could not continue without an act of kindness, a recognition that despite all the fury, life still cried out to survive. YAKUT, she knew, was harsh, but also a mother, and in that moment, YAKUT felt that her own journey could not continue without an act of kindness. Life, despite all the unleashed fury, still cried out to survive. The amulet in her hand pulsed, not with the overwhelming power of before, but with a soft resonance, almost a murmur of encouragement. The cub whimpered again, a sound that pierced the oppressive silence of the newly carved tundra. YAKUT knelt in the loose snow, studying the situation. The block of ice trapping the little wolf's paw was not giant, but it was too heavy for her to move alone. The ice was smooth, impassable. She felt around the edge of the block, feeling the biting cold that emanated from it. The amulet in her palm glowed more intensely, and she felt an intuition, a subtle suggestion of how to use the environment to her advantage. There was a smaller crack in the ice pillar behind the cub, a flaw that could be exploited. With renewed determination, YAKUT began to dig in the loose snow and ice around the crack. Using her hands and the small hunting knife she always carried, the wind whistled, whipping snowflakes into her face, but she ignored the cold and discomfort. Each movement was an effort, her muscles burning beneath the heavy clothes. She needed to create a fulcrum, a lever. The ice cracked as she worked, and the metallic and sulphurous smell of the freshly opened earth hung in the air. The cub watched with wide eyes, its whimpers lessening as YAKUT approached. There was a mix of fear and a glimmer of hope in its gaze, a dependence that touched YAKUT deeply. Finally, after several minutes of exhaustive effort, she managed to widen the crack enough to wedge in a sharp piece of rock she found nearby. With all her strength, she used the rock as a rudimentary lever, applying pressure against the ice pillar and the block that held the cub. A loud crack echoed, and the ice block moved, sliding just a few centimeters. It was not enough to free the cub completely, but it was a start. YAKUT tried again, her muscles trembling with the effort. The amulet pulsed in her hand, and she felt a wave of icy energy course through her arm, strengthening her. It was not a supernatural force, but a clarity of purpose, a connection to the Earth's own resilience. With a groan of effort, she pushed with all she had. This time, the ice block yielded further, revealing the cub's injured paw. The little wolf pulled its paw free with a sharp yelp, limping out of the ice trap. It moved a few steps away from YAKUT, still cautious, but the pain in its eyes had lessened, replaced by palpable relief. Its paw was scratched and bleeding a little, but there seemed to be no fractures. YAKUT retreated slowly, giving the cub space. It watched her for a long moment, its brown eyes fixed on hers. Then, to YAKUT's surprise, it approached, sniffing her outstretched hand. A shiver ran through her body as the wolf's wet snout touched her skin, a soft, unexpected touch. It was a gesture of trust amidst the desolation. Yakutia had spoken with fury, but it had also left a bond. Yakuta felt that this act of compassion was an extension of the earth itself, a recognition that life, even in its most fragile form, deserved a chance. The amulet in her hand glowed a little brighter, as if approving. She had to go. Her grandmother awaited her. But now, the journey felt different. The wolf cub, though small and injured, seemed to have found a new purpose, a new path. It turned, limped a few steps, and looked back, as if inviting her to follow. The amulet in her hand pointed north, in the direction of her home. The cub, however, seemed to indicate a slightly different path, one that wound among the new ice formations, perhaps less direct, but perhaps safer. Yakuta looked at the cub, then at the distant horizon, where the colors of the aurora borealis still danced faintly. The threat of the wolves had dissipated, but the tundra was now a minefield of unknown dangers. And somehow, the presence of that small wolf whom she had saved seemed to be a new guide, a new, unexpected companion on her journey home. She had to trust the earth's intuition and the new connection she had forged. With a sigh, she began to follow the cub, leaving behind the crater of devastation. Yakuta followed the cub, her cautious steps echoing in the heavy silence of the devastated tundra. The little wolf, despite limping visibly, moved with surprising agility, its survival instincts sharpened by pain and fear. It didn't look back often, but each time it did, its brown eyes met Yakuta's, a silent bond forming between them. The path the cub chose was a labyrinth of new fissures and overturned ice blocks, a route Yakuta would never have considered alone. The amulet in her hand pulsed in sync with the little wolf's rhythm, its blue-green light illuminating the slippery ledges and hidden cracks. It was as if the earth itself was whispering the cub's steps, guiding it through the newly created dangers. The wind whistled, no longer with the furious roar of the cataclysm, but with a cold lament that carried the metallic and sulphurous scent of the earth that had been torn open. With each turn, a new landscape was revealed, a brutal testament to Yakutia's strength. Newly risen ice mountains blocked the horizon, and underground rivers, now exposed, bubbled and fumed in deep craters. Yakuta felt the cold penetrate her bones, but the determination to find her grandmother propelled her. With each step, the image of her babushka's aged, blind face became more vivid in her mind. She could not fail. The cub suddenly stopped, its ears twitching, sniffing the air. It let out a small whimper, and Yakuta stopped too, her heart pounding in her chest. There was nothing visible, just the vast, oppressive silence of the tundra. But the little wolf seemed restless, its eyes fixed on a distant point, where the ice rose in a jagged, irregular formation. She knelt, trying to see what the cub perceived. The amulet in her hand intensified its glow, and a sense of alert coursed through Yakuta. It was not fear, but an ancestral caution, a subtle warning from nature. The cub began to circle the ice formation, choosing an even more winding path, as if wanting to avoid something. Yakuta followed, her eyes scanning the terrain for any sign of danger. The silence was so profound, it seemed to swallow every sound, and the lack of life, of birds or other animals, was unsettling. The tundra was empty, as if all life had been swept away by the cataclysm. They walked for hours, the Arctic sun barely rising above the horizon, painting the sky with pale shades of pink and purple. The cub's paw seemed to hurt less now, or perhaps it was just accustomed to the pain, for its pace had become more steady. Yakuta felt a strange gratitude for its company. Amidst such desolation, that small, injured creature was a reminder that life persisted, and that even in the face of Yakutia's primordial fury, compassion had its place. Finally, the cub led them out of the newly formed labyrinth of ice and rock. The landscape opened up a little, revealing a more familiar expanse of snow, though still punctuated by new cracks and uneven terrain. On the horizon, Yakuta could distinguish the distorted silhouette of a mountain range she recognized. It was an important landmark, indicating they were on the right path, albeit a considerable distance from her village. But as her eyes fixed on the mountain range, the cub let out a low whimper and cowered, looking at the ground. Yakuta looked down and saw what disturbed it. In the fresh snow there were footprints. They were not the tracks of a common wolf, nor of a bear. They were large, deep, and had an irregular pattern, almost as if the animal that left them had dragged something heavy. And what was more disturbing, they were not fresh, but they were not old either. They were there at the edge of the new tundra, pointing in the same direction they were going. A shiver ran down Yakuta's spine. The cataclysm had dispersed the pack, but Yakutia, in its fury, might have awakened something older, something that moved in the shadows of the vast and merciless land. The journey home was far from over, and whatever had left those footprints seemed to be on the same path. Yakuta felt the air freeze in her lungs, a sensation that went beyond Yakutia's biting cold. The footprints in the fresh snow were an anomaly, a scar on the already disfigured landscape. The cub, its fur bristling, let out a sharper whimper, its body trembling uncontrollably. It recoiled, pressing itself against Yakuta's leg, its brown eyes fixed on the deep marks. It was not the fear of a common predator. It was a more primitive terror, a reverence for something the cub, with its keen instincts, recognized as a threat from another era. Yakuta knelt, the amulet in her hand pulsing with a cold, intense blue-green light. She observed the footprints closely. They were of colossal size, with claws that dragged in the snow, leaving irregular furrows. There was a subtle scent in the air, a pungent, earthy odor, like wet stone and ancient flesh, that belonged to no animal she knew. Whatever had passed through here, it was heavy, slow, and somehow emanated an aura of unquestionable power. Yakutia, in its fury, had not only reshaped the Earth's surface, but perhaps had unearthed something that should have remained dormant beneath the millennial ice. The cub tugged at her pants, an urgent pull. It pointed its snout in a different direction, a path that led away from the footprints, winding through a narrow fissure between two newly formed ice pillars. Yakuta knew she had to trust the little wolf's instinct. The wisdom of the earth spoke through it now. With a nod, she began to follow the cub, her eyes constantly scanning the terrain for any movement, any shadow that didn't belong. They moved in an almost deafening silence, broken only by the crunch of snow beneath her boots and the cub's panting. The wind had diminished to a whisper, and the absence of any sound of life, no birds, no rodents, was more terrifying than the roar of a storm. The landscape, once a labyrinth of ice and rock, now seemed to stretch into an empty vastness, punctuated by strange formations that looked like gigantic bones emerging from the earth. With each step, Yakuta felt the presence of the creature from the footprints, not as a vision, but as a pressure in the air, a cold that didn't come from the weather. The amulet in her hand trembled, its light flickering like a weak flame. She felt exposed, small before the relentless grandeur of nature and what it had birthed. The image of her grandmother, frail and alone in her cabin, was the only anchor that kept her from succumbing to panic. The cub stopped abruptly, its ears pointing forward. A faint sound, a heavy, slow dragging, broke the silence. It came from somewhere ahead, hidden by the mist that began to rise from the ground. It was not a roar nor a howl, but a sound of friction, of something immense and clumsy moving. Yakuta felt a chill run down her spine. The smell of ancient earth and flesh intensified, almost suffocating. The cub cowered, hiding its snout in the crook of Yakuta's knee, but its eyes were still fixed on the mist. Yakuta pulled her hunting knife, the cold metal in her palm. It was a futile gesture. She knew, but it offered an illusion of control. The dragging sound grew louder, closer. The mist ahead began to stir, as if something was moving within it. The amulet in her hand glowed with a feverish intensity, almost burning her skin. A dark, shapeless silhouette began to materialize in the mist, something so large it seemed to distort the very air around it. There was no time to run, to hide. Whatever it was there, and it was coming towards them. The mist swirled, parting to reveal not a beast of flesh and blood as YAKUT knew them, but a mountain of dark, rough matter. It was colossal, with skin that seemed made of rock and compacted ice, sprinkled with sharp protuberances that resembled stalactites. Its movements were slow, but each step made the earth tremble beneath YAKUT's feet, a deep tremor that resonated in her bones. One of its forelimbs dragged, a shapeless mass that explained the asymmetrical footprints, and from which came the heavy, scraping sound. Two eyes, deep and dull, like black holes in its rocky face, fixed on her, devoid of any recognizable emotion, but laden with an antiquity that made the air thin. The cub let out a whimper, burying itself even deeper into YAKUT's leg, a small ball of trembling fur. Its terror was palpable, a stark contrast to the creature's impassive advance. YAKUT felt her own breath catch in her throat. The hunting knife felt like a twig in her hand, utterly useless against a being that seemed to embody the very landscape. This was not a predator to be outsmarted or fought. It was a force of nature, a primordial entity awakened from a deep slumber. The amulet in her hand pulsed violently, its blue-green light flaring, casting a ghostly glow on the creature's rocky hide. The object burned in her palm, as if struggling against an immense, oppressive presence. A faint hum vibrated from the stone, a sound so low it was almost inaudible, a desperate plea or a silent warning. The creature slowly raised its head, a process that seemed to take an eternity. Its mouth, an irregular fissure in the rock, opened slightly, and an icy breath with the heavy smell of earth and minerals enveloped YAKUT. There were no visible teeth, just endless darkness, but the intention was clear. It was not the hunger of a common animal, but the hunger of something that fed on time and silence. YAKUT knew she couldn't run. The creature was slow, but its immense size meant it could cover ground with deceptive efficiency. And where would she flee? The tundra was a labyrinth of new dangers. Her only hope lay in understanding, in connecting with the earth as her ancestors had taught her. She looked at the cub, whose eyes were wide with a terror that mirrored her own. Then, an idea, desperate and probably foolish, sparked in her mind. The amulet had guided her, protected her. It had reacted to the cataclysm, to the wolves. Could it react to this? With trembling hands, she raised the amulet. Its light intensified even further, becoming a beacon against the oppressive gloom. She focused all her will, all her plea for help, into the stone. The hum grew louder, a sharp lament that seemed to resonate in the ice itself. The creature paused, its massive head tilting almost imperceptibly. The amulet's light seemed to irritate it, like a small spark against an ancient darkness. A low rumble emanated from its chest, a sound like grinding glaciers, a protest against the intrusion. Suddenly, the ground beneath YAKUT's feet began to vibrate. Not the slow tremor of the creature's steps, but a rapid, violent shudder. The air crackled with a cold energy, and the mist around them swirled in tiny vortices. The amulet flared one last time, a dazzling flash of blue-green light, and then exploded in YAKUT's hand. A stinging pain shot through her palm, but before she could cry out, a deafening crack tore through the air. The ice beneath the creature's massive form fractured, not just a superficial crack, but a deep, gaping abyss that opened with terrifying speed. The creature, caught by surprise by the sudden instability, let out a sound that was less a roar and more an ancient stone groan. It began to sink, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum, into the newly formed chasm. Yakuta stumbled backward, pulling the terrified cub with her, just as the edges of the abyss crumbled. The massive form of the creature disappeared into the icy depths, leaving behind only the echoing groan and a cloud of freezing vapor that rose from the fissure. She remained there, breathing heavily, her heart pounding against her ribs. Her hand throbbed where the amulet had been. Looking down, she saw that only fragments remained, embedded in her skin, still faintly glowing. The power had been released and it had worked. Nature, in its brutal and unpredictable form, intervened once more. The abyss slowly sealed itself with the groan of the ice, leaving only a new scar on the tundra. The pungent smell of stone and ancient earth began to dissipate. Silence returned, but it was a different silence now, one that carried the persistent echo of primordial power. The cub, still trembling, looked at Yakuta, then at the spot where the creature had disappeared. Yakuta knew they had been incredibly lucky. The amulet, a gift from her ancestors, had sacrificed itself to save them. Its power was gone, but its spirit remained, a testament to her connection with the earth. Now, more than ever, she felt the weight of her lineage and the urgency of her mission. The path ahead was still fraught with unknown dangers, but she would face them. She had to. Her babushka was waiting. The silence that followed the amulet's implosion was not a relief, but a deafening vacuum. Yakuta remained kneeling, the icy air burning her lungs with each ragged breath. Her right hand throbbed with excruciating pain, a constant ache where the amulet's fragments had embedded themselves. She felt the residual heat of the explosion, a tingling that spread through her arm, but the blue-green light was now just a faint, intermittent glow beneath her skin. The cub, still cowering against her leg, let out a low, trembling lament. It raised its head, its brown eyes fixed on the spot where the creature had disappeared. There was no longer the cloud of vapor, just a dark, newly formed scar on the ice, a grim reminder of the power that had almost consumed them. The abyss had sealed itself, as if the earth had swallowed its own secret. Yakuta tried to stand, but her legs trembled, giving way under the weight of terror and exhaustion. She fell back into the snow, her exhausted body protesting. The hunting knife, forgotten in her hand, fell with a muffled thud. Her eyes swept the desolate landscape, now even emptier and more menacing. Whatever Yakutia had awakened, it had challenged her in a way she never imagined. The earth was not just a home, it was a living entity, unpredictable and, at times, terribly cruel. The cub sniffed the air, then nudged its snout into her injured hand, a gesture of concern that brought a tear to Yakuta's eyes. The physical pain was real, but the emotional pain was deeper. A mix of overwhelming relief and the loss of something that connected her directly to her ancestors. The amulet was gone, but not before fulfilling its final purpose, a sacrifice that echoed the very resilience of life in the tundra. With immense effort, Yakuta managed to sit up, leaning on her knees. She looked at the cub, her eyes meeting its. There was a silent understanding between them, the bond forged through danger and survival. It was her guide, her companion, a symbol of Yakutia itself, wild and untamed. "We have to go," she whispered, her voice hoarse. With each passing moment, her grandmother grew weaker, hungrier. The vision of her babushka, sitting alone in the cabin, was a fire that burned in her chest, warming her against the cold and fear. She picked up the knife, tucking it into her belt. Her injured hand ached, but there was no time for lament. Each fragment of the amulet embedded in her skin was a reminder of the power she carried, no longer in a stone, but within herself. The wisdom of her ancestors was not just in an object, but in her lineage, in her blood, in her unbreakable connection with the earth. The wind began to blow again, a low whisper that carried the smell of snow and ice. The mist had dissipated, revealing a pale grey sky. There was no sun, just a diffuse light that barely illuminated the vast white expanse. Hunger was a constant presence, a tight knot in her stomach. Yakuta stood, swaying slightly. The cub moved ahead, sniffing the ground, then looked back at her, inviting her to follow. It didn't point to the creature's tracks, nor to the sealed abyss. Instead, it indicated a different path, one that wound towards a distant chain of hills where the snow seemed less disturbed. She knew she was still far from home, and the hunt was not yet over. The pack of wolves, though not visible, was still a threat. But something had changed within her. The experience with the primordial creature, the amulet's explosion, had transformed her. She was no longer the frightened young orphan who had left the cabin. She was Yakuta, daughter of Yakutia, and the earth had spoken to her, tested her, and strengthened her. With each step, the pain in her hand was a reminder, but also a source of determination. She had to find food. She had to return to her babushka. The line between life and death had dissolved, but Yakuta had emerged on the other side, stronger, more connected, more alive. She followed the cub, her eyes scanning the horizon, no longer with terror, but with a hardened vigilance. The tundra was relentless, but so was she. The story of her survival, of her connection with the earth and its secrets, was still being written. And Yakuta was ready to write the next chapter, a chapter of hope and resilience, guided by the little wolf's instinct and the promise of a reunion in her cabin.